So, Kaustubh, we all know that you are a Serie A fan. You write a lot about Serie A. So there was a period where everyone was in awe of Serie A. The Rijkaards, your Van Bastens, Maldinis, Ronaldinhos, Ronaldos. But after a certain period of time, it stopped. There was a change in momentum. The other leagues started to rise, and Syria kind of became a bit meek, as you can say. So, why do you think this happened?
I mean, it was down to a lot of reasons because you can actually relate Italian football success to the boom in the economy of Italy itself. Because in the 1980s and 90s, I think there was a boost in Italy's economy in terms of machinery, architecture, and literature, and a lot of different sort of stuff. You can almost call it a mini renaissance of what they had back in the 1600s or 1700s. It was a bit like that, and the ownership at that point was from local Italian businessmen or people who were actual fans of those clubs. And at that point, they spent a lot on players because they were rich and they had the backing of money of Italian people who were actually fans. So they could go out in the market and sign players like Frank Rijkaard and all, basically just every Ajax player at that point, every talented Ajax player who was destined for success at that point, like maybe Juventus are trying at this point. So at that point, a lot of players in Italy exchanged clubs in the country itself. They did not go abroad because the money that was in Serie A, again, because of the ownerships in place and because of the quality of the league there, because the teams there at that point were winning, were competing in Europe at a very, very high level, even though you had clubs like Real Madrid and Man United doing pretty well. There were always about two or three Italian clubs, be it Milan, Juventus won the Champions League at that point in the 1900s. You had Lazio doing pretty well. Lazio faced United in the Champions League in '99. You had Inter as well. You had Roma. I mean, Roma weren't exactly prominent at that point, but you had them playing in the Super Cup, or sorry, the Europa League, or what they call the UEFA Cup at that point. So it lasted, I think, till 2006 when they won the World Cup, and then the Calciopoli thing happened where Juventus got relegated and four other clubs were involved as well. I mean, that was a pretty dark period in Italian football history, but this was a point where a lot of Italian teams, at least the top Italian teams, had this habit or pretty nagging instinct of maybe holding on to pretty aging players. And it perhaps lasted till maybe 2010 or 2011, where Milan lost maybe Pippo Inzaghi or Rino Gattuso. They lost Nesta was there as well at that point. They lost a bunch of Italian players who had played in the World Cup in one go. And at this point, Calciopoli had happened, and this wasn't exactly a period of, let's say, a period of prominence for Italy in terms of their economy. There were even betting scandals happened there in sports and in football itself, because one happened in 2011 itself, where I think Antonio Conte was partially involved. So they lost a lot of players who were aging, but they lost all of them in one single go. And by that time, they couldn't really realize, or maybe before, about maybe 2007, 2006, they hadn't really realized that to replace all these players, they had to uh, perhaps build the spine of maybe a more younger team, because they perhaps over relied on a lot of aging players who had played in the 2006 World Cup, were playing for the last 15 years or something. They were over 30 and they were perhaps about to retire pretty quickly. They never realized that they needed the spine of younger players who could maybe represent Italy or their own club maybe in the next 3 or 4 years. They were so focused on having Nesta or Pirlo or Gattuso play for them, or Zaghi play for them, that they couldn't really focus on their younger players. So that, I think, had a real impact, and that led to them not being a success in the Champions League as well. Milan, of course, were a success because they had this spine of Italian players who were still pretty much relevant, who were still pretty much good enough to maybe go to semifinals at that point. But a point came, I think, in the 2008, 7, 8, or 8, 9 Champions League semifinals where none. I mean, I think there was no Italian team in the semifinals. There were three or at least three or four English clubs there. Chelsea, Arsenal. Arsenal were there in 9, of course, and United, Chelsea, and Arsenal. These four teams were pretty much dominating. Spurs were coming up. Man City had the new ownership, but this was also a point where Italian football lost those local owners. They sort of had foreign owners by that time. Milan more recently had Chinese ownership. Roma have always had American owners since maybe I think 2010 or at some point. They didn't really have fans in charge, and Silvio Berlusconi was one such person who uh, owned Milan because he was a fan of the club. He was perhaps obsessed with the club. He was involved in a lot of negative stuff in Italy, a lot of scandals and stuff. He lost control of Italian football as a whole. He had a lot of influence in Italy, and there was Luciano Moggi who uh, was involved in the Calciopoli scandal as well. He lost just about every post that he had in Italy at that point. So I think it's you can't quite put a finger on it and say this was exactly the reason why Italian football sort of lost its prominence in maybe before the last 2 or 3 years. But it's a combination of maybe 4 or 5 different aspects that I just talked about.
Yeah, maybe, but even like ignoring their ages, maybe Ronaldo's transfer to Italian league or Zlatan's impact is a turning point.
I mean, it is in a sense that they bring a lot of revenues to them. People in countries that perhaps never bothered watching Serie A, they start watching Serie A because of these people, because of the marketing power that these have. Because what Juventus want to do is basically establish themselves as a super club where they want to sell shirts, they want to be on the top of billboards, and they just want to become not this all encompassing club like Man United are or maybe Real Madrid are. They want to assume that figure now, or at least when Ronaldo came in around that time. They just want to make sure that they have this one marquee signing every window. They didn't quite have that this time because of COVID, of course, but that's what they want to do. And I think Juventus as a whole, I mean, in terms of what they want to do for themselves, that's going to help Syria as well. Because when Ronaldo came in, people started watching Serie A all of a sudden, not just because of Juventus, but because they thought this league is maybe back. As you said, I mean, people started thinking that maybe they've got their old mojo back and stuff just because Ronaldo was there, even though Lukaku came in a year later and Zlatan came in January. I think there's still a lot to be done because I don't think Juventus are going to challenge in Europe as fiercely as they did under Max Allegri. Milan are in the Europa League facing Celtic next. I mean, they might just have a chance there because they've got a lot of depth in that team. I don't see Lazio doing much. Don't see Roma doing much because there's still a lot to be done for a lot of those clubs in there. Because at I mean, Inter probably the best team in the division right now, but apart from them, a lot of clubs in there are undergoing this transition period where uh, they need to realize exactly where they're going. And once they sort of fix that, because Italian football, I mean, if we go back to maybe 2012 or 13, it was a similar period where they did have a fair few number of star players back then. But again, it was down to the transition periods of different clubs there. So if those clubs figure out uh, what they're doing in the future, or maybe at this point, or maybe start competing in Europe or get quality depth into their side, I think Italian football would really benefit from that. But in terms of revenue or marketing and the number of people that watch the league, I think, yeah, that's of course improved because of Ronaldo, Lukaku, or Ibrahimovic and all these people.
So, how do you expect Syria to pan out this season? Like, do you expect Juve to challenge, like again, win the title again under Pirlo?
I mean, it's a tough one because I watched Juventus quite a lot already this season. Even saw a bit of their friendly preseason friendly against Novara. but I think they still want to play a style of football which is unique, which is pretty new to the players that they have, and it takes a while for them to adjust to it because they played Roma recently, which which was a pretty terrible game for Juve defensively, where they never knew what they were doing at the back. They were constantly overrun by Mkhitaryan, Pedro, and Edin Dzeko. They had no clue defensively, and it happened last night as well when when they were facing Crotone. They've got some really good players in there, but it's a new system for them, a lot like it was for Maurizio Sarri last season. It takes it's going to take at least some months for them to really play consistently under Pirlo and in his unique system. So I think they might not be my Serie A favorites. So maybe Inter are, but for Inter, the thing is, again, it's make or break for Conte this season because he's got all the
Yeah.
players that he needed. I mean, they may be aging players, and maybe a lot of them are centre backs who can play wing backs and stuff. But that's what Conte always wants in his team, and he finally has what he wants. Something that he was crying about last season, towards the end of last season, after every single game in the press conferences, he used to talk about backing from the board and the sort of players he wanted and stuff. He's finally got it, but the season hasn't exactly started well. They were pretty sort of average against Fiorentina. They lost yesterday. They were held to a draw by Lazio, who aren't exactly the best team in Italy right now either. I think it's been a shaky start. Even against Benevento, I think Inter struggled defensively. I think they've got a lot of issues to fix. Milan has started the season pretty well. Lazio haven't. Roma, you're never quite sure. But I think it's still a pretty open race. And Atalanta have lost just one game. You never know about them either. So I think it's still a pretty open race. But as soon as maybe Inter have all their players back from, I think they've got 3 or 4 of their players out because of COVID. Skriniar was out, Bastoni was out, Nainggolan is now fit, Ashley Young's out. So I think those players are very, very important for how Inter defend. It was pretty evident last night. So
Yeah.
because Alexander Kolarov was pretty poor playing at centre back. So I think once they have all the players fit, once Damian starts to play regularly, they'll have a team that can actually compete on maybe 2 fronts, or maybe win the not win the Champions League. I mean, at least go pretty far in it. I know Conte's teams don't exactly do well in Europe, but they've got this core group of players that Conte really trusts, and I think that's really matters. And because of just that, I think uh, Inter probably my favorites. I mean, they're just slight favorites, but they're favorites
Napoli?
after all. Yeah, Napoli again. I mean, for them, I think it's again about relying on uh, a bunch of players, a lot like Everton in the Premier League. I mean, it's no disrespect, but Napoli has
Yeah.
started pretty well. I love Victor Osimhen and what he did at Lille and what he's doing at Napoli already. He's not scoring goals, but he's contributing a lot off the ball. I think Napoli are pretty sure short title contenders and top 4 contenders as well. But again, it comes down to the players that they constantly rely on, especially Osimhen there, because they've got Arek Milik, who they tried to sell, and
Yeah.
he has sort of spoken out against them and stuff. I don't think he's going to help them out quite a lot. So if Osimhen isn't playing, I'm not sure who they are going to rely on to maybe help them out week in, week out, and especially if they're playing in Europe and the Europa League. So I think that's one concern that I have for Napoli. But yeah, I think the way they're playing and the core group of players that they have, they can surely compete for it. But yeah, I think they'll probably finish third. Maybe.
Another team that has performed quite well in the recent years. They went from a mid-table team to a Champions League or a Europa League spot confirmed, and that is Atlanta. So,
Yeah,
what do you think Gasperini can sustain this good run that he has got?
I think for Atalanta, a lot of it is down to what the club does as a whole, not just Gasperini. Because if you give Gasperini the sort of players that he needs, he'll probably get you a Champions League every single season. I think he'll do that this season as well, even though they lost to Napoli yesterday. I think this is a sort of a transition period for them where they got rid of about 2 or 3 of their players, and they just were looking for extra depth in their squad because they are now increasing their, let's say, ambition. They did pretty well against PSG in the Champions League. They did lose in the end, but they still played pretty well in the first half, created a fair amount of chances. And the sort of system that they have, it's easy to get tired in that system for players, especially
Yeah.
if they've got aging
Yeah.
players like Ilicic or Papu Gomez. They've got aging players in there who won't play necessarily 60 games a season for you. They have pretty good depth in the forward areas, they must say. I mean, they've got Sam Lammers in, they've got Alexei Miranchuk there. They're pretty good players, but it's their concern at the back, which got exposed yesterday. It's always been a concern, but it's about giving Gasperini the right sort of players to play, to maybe just use that ultra attacking system in just about every game. So if teams figure them out at some point, especially in this transition period, I think they might just fall out of the top four as well. Because we saw yesterday, I think Christian Romero,
Yeah.
their new signing, who was more used to playing in a low block, uh, played in a more expansive system. He struggled a lot
But
yesterday. Probably had the poorest game of his career. So it's new signings like this that just show that they are in a transition period. They had Fabio De Paoli playing as well. He was pretty poor there first start of the season. Even he was playing at Sampdoria in a low block under the great Claudio Ranieri. He of course likes a low block. So he struggled as well. So these are the sort of players who will need to learn about the new system quite a bit in the next few weeks and months. And I think that's probably because I think it's not exactly the best thing for them this season, but the sort of club they are pretty sustainable in a lot of different ways. Like they sell a lot of their players, but they sign a lot of players on pretty cheap values, and they like they did for Amar Traore with Man United. They did that for Dejan Kulusevski as well. These are their youth products who uh, are probably wonder kids to quite an extent, because I think Kulusevski is one of the best talents in European football, and so is Amar Traore. I think if they get a lot of money from these sales, they've got this habit of signing younger players of maybe 17 or 18 from other bigger Italian clubs, and then they sell them on or maybe loan them out. So their system, the way that club functions is pretty sustainable. But this season, I do have doubts about them.
We've seen that Max Allegri has been out of job for almost 2 years. Which club's profile that's like he suits most? Do you think like he? I mean, I'm not only out or anything, but if like knowing the board that we know Man United has, if Oli gets sacked, do you think Max Allegri can do like a job there over
I
someone
think,
like Pochettino?
yeah, I think for a, for a club like Man United, you desperately need, especially with the Glazers, you need a manager who isn't exactly looking for a right profile of players. Like if you look at manager like Ole, or you look at a manager like Pochettino, or maybe Marcelo Bielsa, they look at a specific sort of player. Like they want a certain set of qualities in them. But Allegri is the sort of manager, you can give him Jesse Lingard, you can give him Mario Mandzukic. He'll make sure that he comes up with a system where he brings the best out of those players, plays them to their strength. And it's not like if Ole is given maybe Mario Mandzukic, he'll probably not play him, and he'll maybe not use him to his strengths. That's not a criticism; it's just how it might be. But Allegri is someone who doesn't exactly have a set specific system for how his teams play. He's pretty flexible in terms of formations, in terms of systems, in terms of tactics. He's a lot like Carlo Ancelotti himself. He can play different formations. He can play 3-5-2, play 4-2-3-1, 4-3-3, all sorts. So I think United probably need a manager. I mean, not now. I mean, in the future, if Ole does get sacked, which I don't think he will get sacked. But if Allegri comes in, he's the sort of manager who will probably get more out of Man United than maybe Pochettino will, because you've got this board where they won't always give you the players that the managers want. And Allegri is someone who won't demand one specific sort of players. Like he won't demand a player who's got brilliant work rate. He'll make the best of what he already has. Ole does that as well, which is why I think uh, he's going to last a lot longer than people think he will. So I think if Ole goes, he's already sort of established a core group of players where a new
Yeah,
manager can come in and
yeah,
make sure that he wins trophies with that, or maybe he can as well. But Allegri will have this core group of players which will really thrive under him. They can thrive under Pochettino as well, but Allegri is much more flexible in terms of shapes, styles, which Pochettino always hasn't been, which is why I think Spurs didn't quite win a title under him, a Premier League title, which I think they should have won. They were pretty good under him. And I think Allegri can also be a pretty good fit for PSG in the sense that they've got this star quality in that team. They've got stardust there. They've got a star player in just about every single position. But Thomas Tuchel is doing pretty well. I mean, but is he the sort of manager who's going to take them to winning the Champions League? I know Allegri hasn't won the Champions League himself, but he's someone who knows how to manage games. Tuchel hasn't quite showed that, be it in Mainz or Dortmund or PSG at this point. Allegri is someone who can make sure that this star group of players play at their strengths. Every single player plays at their strength, and he brings the best out of them. That's what those players, or let's say the egos in her PSG team, want really. So I think Allegri likes PSG as well, and PSG like Allegri. So in case Tuchel leaves PSG at some point, which I think he might just leave PSG at the end of the season if things don't go well. I think Allegri will probably go there and make them a better team than they currently are.
Speaking of another sleeping giant, AC Milan, they have spent a lot of money in the transfer window, but recently there has been a shift in their transfer policy.
Yeah.
What do you think this change brought about, and will it help them in any way?
I think the window that they just had was probably the best that they've ever had in maybe the last after Max Allegri, because you look at their transfer window of 2017, they probably spent for the sake of it. They signed players that didn't quite work out for them in the long term. They signed this guy Ricardo Rodriguez, who's already left. They signed Bonucci, who left after a single season. They signed Lucas Biglia, who probably played just a single season while being fit. I mean, he had those back issues throughout his career and at Milan as well. They signed Fabio Borini, who was close to moving to Swansea. I'm not sure if he has moved. I don't quite remember that. So they signed a lot of players who it was almost like throwing paint on the wall with a blindfold on and thinking that you're gonna come up with Mona Lisa or something. But this
Hmm.
at this point of time, they've clearly got a policy. I mean, they know the sort of profile of players that they want, and the sort of system that Stefano Pioli is trying to implement into their team, and all the players sort of uh, match the demands of that team in terms of position, in terms of mentality, in terms of their technical ability. That's something we haven't quite seen at Milan since Allegri left, or maybe even under Allegri himself, because a lot of transfers under his time were didn't quite work out too well. Uh, but at this point, they've got especially I think they've got maybe more depth than Juventus at this point, especially in the midfield or in the forward position. So it shows that they've got a lot of ambition, not just in Serie A. They want to win the Europa League. They want to win the Coppa Italia. They want to challenge on a lot of fronts. So I think this is probably the best I've seen of Milan ever since the stuff that's happened, the ownership issues, the managerial stuff that happened since 2012 and 13.
uh, most of our viewers are Premier League fans. Can you give us a list of like five young unknown players that play across all other leagues? Your list?
I mean, yeah, you mean not from the Premier League, right?
Yeah, not from the
Yeah.
Premier League. Across all other leagues.
Yeah. So I've just said that Dejan Kulusevski is probably, for me, one of the best talents in Europe. I think he just turned 20. I'm not quite sure. But when he was at Atlanta on loan at Parma, I really wanted Man United to sign him because he is the sort of right winger that
Yeah.
they were looking at. He can play as a striker, play as a second striker, play as a number 10. So a lot of people say, look at United should sign someone like Nicolo Zaniolo. He's of course injured, but for me, Zaniolo isn't quite a right winger. He's more of a number 10, more of a attacking midfield player. So I think Kulusevski is someone who's probably going to be world class in maybe 2 or 3 years, and he's at the club where he's got a manager who really trusts him. He plays him just about every single game, and he almost carried Parma last season because if not for him, they would have got relegated. You can look at the sort of goals that he scored. There was a game against Napoli last season where he almost killed off Kalidou Koulibaly, and Koulibaly got injured actually after that. So it says a lot about the sort of player Kulusevski is. He's just got about everything. He's still 19, 20. He's got physicality of a 25-year-old. So that's one player. And for you can't go past Dutch clubs and talk about young players. So you got Ryan Gravenberch at Ajax there. I think he compared himself to Paul Pogba, and people have started comparing him to Pogba as well, which is pretty strange. But Ajax fans do have criticism about him, and the same as United fans do for Pogba, because they say that he doesn't work hard enough when tracking back. Gravenberch doesn't work hard enough while tracking back. But he's very, very similar to Pogba in a lot of ways. When Frenkie de Jong left Ajax and Lasse Schöne left Ajax, he started to play as a 17-year-old, which is a big thing at Ajax. I know it's usual for Ajax, but it's still a big thing to play regularly and to earn the praise of many people in Dutch football. So he's one to look out for. Barcelona, of course, signed Serginho Dest. I think he is a player who's perfect for them, and it's a brilliant signing. I just hope they don't mess that up like they've messed up every single transfer since 2016, because I think he's a real talent as well. And specifically for Italian football, I think if it wasn't for Nicolo Zaniolo's injury, I would have said that, but he's much more well known. But in Portugal, you've got Joelson Fernandes there, who actually is pretty good friends with Bruno Fernandes himself. Uh, he is a right-footed left winger who can play on the right as well. He started playing for Sporting when he was around 17, and he played for the under 21s or 23s when he was just 16. And he, I think, contributed to about 7 or 8 goals, which is quite a big thing for a player who's still 17. I think he's got a pretty cheap release clause. It's about 45 million euros, which is pretty cheap for a player with potential like Jolson. I think Arsenal were looking at him last summer, didn't quite sign him because he wasn't exactly their priority. Barcelona have looked at him, Leipzig have looked at him. Sporting, of course, have got this culture of having players that make it big, be it Ronaldo or Nani and a lot of other players, Luis Figo as well. So he reminds me a lot of Nani. I mean, Nani, especially when he was early on at United, not the Nani of his Sporting days. He looks a lot more mature than Nani was. And I think he's someone people really need to look at in the future. And then I think Nice have got, Jury there. He's a player who I think Leon sold when no one expected. He's a youth product of the Lyon Youth Academy. He left the club just this summer. People expected him to play regularly. They expected him to place maybe Bertrand Traore, or if Moussa Dembele left Leon, they thought he'll replace them. These guys never left. Traore, of course, went to Aston Villa.
Yeah.
But this guy wanted regular first team football. So he handed in a transfer request to Leon, and Leon sold him for I think just 7 million euros, which is just peanuts for a player like him. He's gone to Nice. He's played I think 7 or 8 games. He's already scored twice, assisted twice. He's 20. He's I think probably the best talent in France right now, for me at least. I mean, he's since he came for just 7 million, it gives Nice the room to maybe ask, maybe in maybe 2 seasons or 2 summer transfer windows, ask about fee close to maybe 50 million if he develops well. So I think he's one to keep an eye on as well. But yeah, a lot of these players, it's just down to the coaching that they go through, or the injury stuff that happens, because a lot of players that I mentioned are, as people say, they are pace merchants in a lot of ways. They are raw players, they are raw talent. So it's important for them to be coached in the right sort of way. So I think jury is much more mature than the others I've talked about. But yeah, I think these are some of the players that will surely make it big.